Hello, today I'm reviewing the Vaxee NP-01 All Matte Edition. This mouse was the first design from Vaxee, a company formed by the employees that used to run Zowie, a legendary mouse maker that focused on creating esports-centric mice that have been some of the most popular in the world. And you can see that legacy here with the NP-01. It also has that simple, no-frills approach to mouse design where it's entirely plug and play and light on features, with a heavy focus on executing its shape well and delivering a high-quality product first and foremost. But there were some issues with the original NP-01 that did show, despite the previous experience, this was still the company's first mouse. Namely, there was some slight creaking on the left side here and a strange coating that overall hampered the experience. But Vaxee did stay true to their motto of continuous improvement and slowly updated their lineup over time. First with the NP-01G that fixed the major issues here, then with the rest of their mice that all released as flawless products. Then finally to the all-matte versions that we see here, that represent the highest evolution of their products seen to date and demonstrate truly flawless execution that is unmatched in the mouse market, period. Seriously, it has been so impressive to see Vaxee's slow rise to the top. It is incredible to see a company you've always supported achieve what you believe that they are capable of. But in the time it took to update the NP-01, it ended up being forgotten about somewhat, and now it has become the most underrated design out of Vaxee's entire lineup. It has still gotten some love from CSGO players. It is actually one of their most popular mice. But the peripheral community in specific has been a lot more interested in their other stuff. The NP-01S is the community favorite by a long shot, and for good reason. It is our most universal design, so it has the broadest appeal. And personally, it is still my favorite out of their lineup. So I do think that it does deserve its place as the most popular Vaxee mouse. Then the Outside AX, while it is still much less popular than the NP-01S, still has somewhat of a cult following, where it is huge amongst big Ergo fans, and those who like it really sing its praises. But it is more niche since it really leans into that classic Ergo design, which is still popular, don't get me wrong, but it's going to be more love it or hate it, and thus it is less popular. Then finally, the NP-01 seems to be completely forgotten about. Even I initially dismissed it. I have already had an NP-01 for a long time, and I've put a good amount of time on it, but it always felt pretty meh. Still good, but not great. Always enjoyable enough to use, but not really over other mice. So I wasn't interested enough to put it back into my rotation or revisit it extensively to make a full review like I did with the other Vaxee products. But now that I have picked up this pink all-matte version, I've really found a new appreciation for this mouse, and it's started to become a personal favorite. It's still the most niche of Vaxee's lineup easily due to its extremely unique feel and pretty aggressive design, so it is not going to be a universal recommendation, but there is a lot of potential here. So I want to break this down in detail to try to help you figure out if this great mouse would be a good fit for you personally. First, we need to, of course, talk about the shape. It is always the most important part about any mouse, but it is always particularly relevant for Vaxee mice since they all have unique designs that are quite innovative. For the NP-01, its innovation is that it combines elements of both ergonomic and symmetrical mice. That means that it has the top of a symmetrical mouse like the S2, where it is relatively flat and the buttons are the same height. But it also has the curves of an Ergo like the EC2, where the sides flare asymmetrically to match your hand's natural curvature. It is in this combination of multiple very broad features of entirely different designs where the magic starts to happen. Most importantly, it allows the mouse to integrate the comfort of an Ergo with the more typical symmetric feel, which is huge because not everyone will always vibe with an Ergo mouse, myself included. Personally, I feel that these slanted buttons make my hand a little bit overly relaxed, since they end up pushing the inside of my hand up to a more tilted position, which is more neutral for my fingers and wrist, and naturally has much less tension throughout. Of course though, this is very comfortable, because less tension does mean less fatigue, so it is highly conducive to long-term consistency that definitely limits choking, so my performances definitely seem less variable with Ergo mice. But for me, this more relaxed feel changes how I aim too significantly. For example, I'm a little too lazy with so little tension in my arm and wrist, which causes my aim to get a little bit sloppy, which always just leads to awkward individual moments. So though it is so consistent that it has a place sometimes, and I do enjoy using them, but only sometimes, because it is still too much of a departure from the typical mouse feel for it to be a potential main. So here is where the NP-01 with its flat buttons comes in to save the day. It ends up flattening out your hand and your wrist to a position that activates more muscles in this area, which for me keeps things feeling responsive and tight, much like a more typical symmetrical design would. But I should still note that it doesn't feel aggressive by any means, and is still much more conducive to a relaxed grip. It is just more aggressive when compared to a fully asymmetric ergo, which are usually the peak of these relaxed grip styles. This is because the curves on the side here do so well to cradle your fingers, so you don't really have to squeeze the mouse to get a grip. Instead, they just nestle into these little grooves, which locks you in with little effort. More specifically, this thumb groove here is deep with an aggressive flare, where it's highly slanted to help with picking the mouse up, and it quickly curves outward here to create a clear spot for your thumb, which does help with creating consistent placement right underneath these side buttons here, and also gives a good spot for your thumb to pull against and control the mouse. As opposed to a more flat design that lets your thumb slide around, you are locked in, which does allow you to incorporate your fingers a little bit more, which I felt has always helped with mouse control, especially when you get your thumb involved due to how strong it is in comparison to every other finger. Then this flare here follows your thumb as it curls around, which encourages a more relaxed placement, now that you can be well supported without having to aggressively curl. Again, it just cradles this thumb meat in here and it eases you into a very relaxed, yet still locked in position. Next, on the other side, you have this very gentle curve, which heavily encourages your fingers to straighten out and grip it towards the end. Since this curve does, again, follow your fingers along, which helps it feel incredibly natural in this relaxed style. And once again, once you reach this end point here, it is also very concave to help with picking the mouse up without needing to aggressively squeeze it. Plus, as that same spot where it starts to curve outward here, which helps you to mount your fingers into a more consistent placement and again manipulate the mouse for fine finger control without any sliding or movement occurring. It is really impressive how much you can incorporate fingers into your mouse control without adjusting your grip at all. So, overall, the curvy sides lock in your fingers with minimal effort, which is highly comfortable, just like an ergo. You don't need to squeeze, the grip just happens on its own. And they also allow for a high degree of finger control, which combines well with the flat buttons to get that more responsive feel. Also, to facilitate a more relaxed grip, the mouse has some real bulk to it, mainly in this back hump area, which again helps support your hand and bring back some of that full palm ergo flavor, especially when the hump is as large and hand-filling as on the NP-01. I seriously cannot overstate how oppressive this hump feels. It forces the most hand contact I have ever experienced, even out of the classic ergo shapes that are known for this. This is because it is large, of course. It is pretty wide from both the top and bottom, so it always does well to fill out the very edges of your palm because of this wide stance. And its highest point is also towards the rear, which puts the hump deeper into your hand, and it really starts to get it into this mid-palm area. But there are definitely other mice out there with similarly sized backs that don't feel nearly as full as this, because most of this full palm invading feel comes from its asymmetric design. So again, it is highly relevant to influencing how this mouse feels in hand. For example, on the right side here, the flare occurs a little bit higher up than is usual, and it much more gradually slopes in order to match this outer palm area during a normal grip, which helps create contact in a very large surface area here. This feels incredible for my new mouse grip in particular, because what I've been doing is wrapping this edge of my palm around this right side flare. So now that I do have this very gentle curve to wrap around, I get very full contact throughout this entire region, instead of some of these more flatter mice that tend to only make contact in this bottom half. Plus, this contact is super natural too. I don't really have to pull the mouse back into my hand, and instead it just happens, because it does really almost perfectly match the natural curvature of your hand. It is, again, so ergonomic. Then on the other side, the thumb curve is relatively much lower and far more aggressive in how far it juts out. This mouse really cut into your thumb meat here, and really push your entire thumb in this joint up and out, which encourages wrapping your thumb over top this very aggressive ridge, which ends up tilting your grip a little bit, which is usually more comfortable for people like me that are natural tilt grippers. Then also because this thumb groove very cleanly flows up to the very top of the mouse, you do end up getting support all throughout this entirety of the thumb meat area. Again, not restricting contact to just the bottom area of your palm. And finally, in the very back here, the highest point is ever so slightly to the left. This helps the mouse wedge itself a little bit into your palm pocket that naturally forms. So it helps it create contact in the very middle of your palm here, despite having a relatively wide stance, which is somewhat atypical. Since usually because these wide mice stretch out your hands a little bit, they leave the middle portion a little bit neglected. But this ever so slight bias here in the very back region really helps it fill out the entirety of this mid-palm area and make near complete contact. So when you end up combining all these features into one, you end up getting a hump that nearly assimilates itself into your palm. And this happens no matter how you grip it, really. It forces its way into your palm like no other. There is simply no avoiding a dumpy of this caliber. And unless you have very big hands, most claw grips will end up feeling like palm variations because of how much contact is made. Pure palm grip though, still probably not the best because it is so flat on the top here, so it is going to be pretty hard to make contact in this knuckle area, which I see being important for a lot of palm grippers. But for hybrid claw palm grips, this mouse is perfect in what it was made for, since it's got this huge back to really wrap your palm around. But even though the hump is very large and absolutely uniquely hand-filling, the mouse doesn't actually feel that big in hand, because the front is actually very moderately sized. For reference, the exact same as the S2. They have an identical height, the exact same grip width, and also an equivalent shape. The only actual difference that you could possibly point out is that the S2 has very slight comfort grooves, while the NP-01 is completely flat, but in hand they feel exactly the same. Which does help to make the NP-01 feel more like a medium mouse overall, and for my relatively small 18x9 hands, it feels great. This mouse is seriously deceptively small despite its back, because it isn't crazy long or really bulky at the middle. It's a nice little in-between size that is quite comfy. Instead, all of the largeness is contained to the back here, where you do have an oppressively large hump that feels massive despite its medium size overall. And here is where you start to run into the potential issues of its shape. Because since it does force a sort of palm variation, it forces this much contact, it is going to start to feel a little bit restrictive. Because there really is nowhere to move this mouse in a claw grip really. And if you deviate at all from a completely locked in grip, you will start to notice that you're impacting the mouse into your palm area. Since there is just nowhere else for it to go, it absolutely has to hit into the meaty edges of your palm. You still do, of course, have a good sense of finger control due to the curves like I talked about earlier, but it is still very restricted to small movements. And the range of motion is absolutely abysmal. When you combine this poor range of motion with the high 70-gram weight, which is still usable but quite heavy for me personally, it ends up getting pretty clunky, which is a huge blow to this mouse in faster paced games. Again, still usable here because it is very controllable, so you can absolutely keep up for games that require raw mechanics. This is a great shape for aim. I cannot emphasize this enough. It always feels so sharp and so on point because it does so well to keep you in control of the mouse at all times. But the back is so big that it feels restrictive and limits your range of motion heavily, which is especially impactful on large angle movements. This has been particularly relevant for me lately because I have been maining Overwatch and specifically playing a lot of Echo. And when I am flying around and trying to hit people at these awkward downward angles, I really notice this range of motion heavily impacting me. Because every single time I try to pull the mouse downwards, I hit this edge of my palm so hard, especially in this very aggressive thumb region, which makes me completely run out of room to pull the mouse back as far as I need to, and it just feels pretty bad. So this is just really not a mouse that I want to use on my current main game, which is quite unfortunate. Mice like the Z813C, G33SE, and Phantom Small just simply don't have this issue, so they end up being much more enjoyable to use. And it also makes all these mice feel so much more effortless, since I'm not actively fighting against the mouse, constantly impacting this meaty regions of my palm. But for slower paced games like tac shooters, this mouse is excellent, and has actually been my current favorite for this specific application. Because the lack of a high range of motion is much less of an issue here. Instead, you get the pure benefits of that locked in stability, and I have noticed my crosshair placement is incredibly consistent with this mouse, because of how little it really moves in my hand. And even when your initial placement is off, it is quite easy to correct, since your fingers feel very in control with micro corrections. Then finally, that very relaxed grip you get that I was talking about is very comfortable. So it is a mouse that blends into your hand extremely well. I don't have to think about it at all, and is much more so a natural extension of my body. This sort of feeling is always great for being calm and collected, which is extremely important in slower paced games, since it reduces choking and is overall better for high pressure scenarios. So this is always something that you should be looking for. Still though, I do think I aim better with those other mice that I pulled out earlier, and those are great options for tac shooters too. But the NP-01 just does a lot better to get me in the right headspace for tac shooters, where I'm naturally much more calm and much more relaxed with it. So it will likely continue to be my go-to for these games over even other mice that I enjoy more. So this difference between performance in both fast and slow games overall puts this mouse in a pretty awkward spot for me personally, where for my main game right now it is entirely suboptimal, which will cut its use time down a lot in the future. but it still has a great niche intact FPS. There it feels quite excellent, which will 100% keep it in my main rotation for the foreseeable future. So only time will tell really how much I end up using this mouse, and whether it can hold up as a potential main. I will cover this again in a few months with a new top mice video, but until then this is a more of a sometimes option, where it's great in some areas but there are clear enough downsides to inhibit me from using it all the time. So for you guys watching, be a little bit careful in picking up this mouse. It is still an incredibly well designed shape, with a very high potential for people who want stability with control. But it is so extreme in the back end here that it can really turn you off, like it did with me initially, and like it still does in faster paced titles. So proceed with caution, but keep it on your radar. It absolutely deserves your thoughtful consideration, since it is one of the best designs out there and criminally underrated. What it does well is so good that I cannot believe it isn't talked about more than it is. Now moving on to its general quality. I must say, right off the bat, that this is the most premium mouse I have ever used. I cannot stress this enough because it's not even close, really. The attention to detail displayed here is simply flawless. It is actually scary good. The only possible complaint that one could make is that the cable could be better, but even then, it's not that bad at all. The issue is that it is a little bit stiff and relatively inflexible. So at extreme angles, you will end up feeling a little bit of a tug, which does start to slightly affect the mouse. But the stiffness also helps hold its shape, so it won't flop around, and it also allows you to eliminate cable drag with its very prominent stress relief here, which in combination ends up removing a lot of variables and keeping things feeling consistent cable-wise. So it's still perfectly fine, and I've never had a major issue with any of Vaxee's cables. This position was also reinforced by my recent experience with paracording my NP-01S. This was of course an upgrade, and Lethal's cables are the best I have ever used. So it's certainly way better than the stock experience, but I was surprised by how small of an upgrade it actually was in practice, because 99% of the time I honestly was not feeling a meaningful difference here. The only actual difference is that you don't quite run into that extreme angle problem where you end up feeling the cable starting to flex. Because for everything else, when you're actually in the center of your pad, the difference is entirely negligible, I feel. Once I'm used to Vaxee's standard cable, the difference is meaningless, honestly. So the worst part about this mouse, by far, isn't even that bad, and every single thing else about it is beyond premium. The build quality, for example, is simply unmatched. It is absolutely flawless, with no creak or flex to speak of. The true tank-like experience at display here. In fact, Vaxee mice are so solid that it changes how I view other options, because even other stuff that feels well made is just a little bit off in comparison, because nothing is as solid and with a completely seamless shell like Vaxee mice are. Logitech endgame gear and a good Zowie copy are all close to achieving that same tank-like Vaxee feel, but something about it never quite feels as solid in hand as a good Vaxee mouse. But unlike some of these other mice I'm looking at you, Zowie, they don't have any of those quality control concerns, and every copy I've ever heard of or ever personally tried have all been identically flawless. Like, it's not even fair, really. These mice are just simply built different. And it is one of those things that you have to get in hand to really understand why. The coating as well is fantastic, and another example of continuous improvement at work. This is of course the new all matte edition, so it has that same slightly rubberized coating that you saw on the back shell extended throughout the buttons. The buttons still actually feel a little bit different than the rest of the shell though, because the plastic on them is more textured, which does shine through the coating a little bit and give them a slightly more abrasive feel. But the coating on top of the entire mouse helps to make it feel overall more cohesive, because with the old coatings the buttons really stuck out like a sore thumb. Personally, I still don't mind it, but it did always feel very different, which was kinda weird. You do certainly notice the lack of coating on the buttons here. So this full shell coating is definitely less distracting, and again makes the entire mouse more cohesive in its feel. Also, it makes the buttons, of course, much grippier, especially when you have that little bit of texture underneath like I was talking about. So you definitely do not slide around nearly as much, and your grip is far more consistent. Initially, I thought that this was not a problem on Vaxee's old coatings, but now that I have experienced what it could be, I definitely am noticing the slipping a lot more. Then, just like their old mice, the coating all around feels extremely high quality. It is quite grippy, and that slightly rubberized plastic feel is quite premium. It can get a little bit slippery with a very large amount of sweat, since moisture does tend to bead up on top of it, which is kind of weird. But this is much less of an issue on the NP-01's shape in particular, since it is so relaxed I don't really have to squeeze to get a good grip, and therefore sweat is less affected. Next, the main clicks are real standouts here. Vaxee buttons are easily the best I have ever used, and the NP-01 all matte is no exception here. They are light with a great sense of smooth tactility, which helps them to feel quick and responsive with a clear actuation point, and all without being fatiguing due to an excessive weight or a very sharp click feeling. Then they have minimum pre-travel, which helps clean up the switch feel and avoid any unnecessary rattling. But they still have very generous post-travel, which is tightly tensioned. This gives a click a very soft feel where they don't bottom out and smack the shell, which ends up feeling very harsh. Instead, they meet a higher amount of resistance and very quickly spring back, which does give them a uniquely bouncy feel, which is so fun and incredibly premium. Well executed post-travel is absolutely key to designing a good click. This new coating on the buttons does make the clicks feel a little bit heavier due to that extra mass, but this isn't really a bad thing since the old buttons were so light anyways, so it is totally fine and honestly more in line with other main clicks, so there is no real downside here. Finally, they also have a very low debounce setting here that you can change on the bottom, and that is indicated with the LED. Changing it down to the 2 millisecond setting here additionally makes the clicks feel even more responsive. This may seem like a small difference, and honestly the default 8 millisecond is still totally fine and in line with other mice. But I would always recommend going all the way down to 2 and taking the time to getting used to it, because it feels incredible once you do. And when you combine it with the already premium click feel, it easily becomes the snappiest switch on the market. Like, it actually makes you play better, no exaggeration. It is so tight and so responsive that you will hit better shots. Trust me, it feels that good. This is the only button I've ever felt this way on, so Vaxee mice are again just built different, and you really have to try them to experience this yourself. There is no going back once you experience this premium of a click. Then the scroll, again, good for me, but in this case it's going to be far more preferential, because it is crazy tactile with extremely well-defined bumps, and very tight tensioning to keep it feeling stiff and bouncy. Personally, I do like all of these aforementioned qualities, and those are all things I look for in a wheel, so this is one of the best options for me personally. But I totally understand how some won't like how harsh it feels, and most importantly, how loud it is. So be aware that if smooth and quiet wheels are important to you, this mouse may actually just be a no-go, because it is crazy oppressive how tactile and how loud this wheel is. Then the side buttons are fine. This isn't something that is particularly important to me since I don't use them that much, but they are still pretty decent here. There is very little pre and post travel, so they are well implemented. But the actual plastic on the buttons themselves feels cheap and thin, which makes the tactility feel a little bit hollow. It still isn't bad, especially compared to other side buttons, but I feel like just thicker plastic here would have helped so much. And finally, the stock feet are also great, some of the best options out there honestly. They are very smooth and work well on a wide variety of pads, which is important because most stock feet have some weird compatibility issues with them, where on most pads they are completely fine and entirely usable, but on some specific setups they are completely whack. But with Vaxees, they are smooth and premium on whatever you use them on, so they definitely get great bonus points for that, which feels great and makes it much easier to recommend this mouse when I can nearly guarantee you're going to get a good stock experience. The only real downside here is that they are a little bit slower than aftermarket options, which is particularly relevant for someone like me that changes feet on every mouse I use. So even with this mouse, with the good stock feet, I did replace them with Tiger Ice, and they have felt great. In particular, Ice are faster than other aftermarket options like core pads, with noticeably lower static friction, which I have felt helps to make the mouse feel a little bit less clunky. Since it is kind of heavy and a little bit bulky in the back, you definitely start to notice this extra speed and most importantly, less resistance on getting the mouse moving from a startup. So Ice in particular are a very natural fit for the NP-01 and one that I would highly recommend. Again, stock feet, totally fine, completely usable, but aftermarket, pure PTFE is still unmatched. So overall, this mouse is incredible, and as always, Vaxee has thoroughly impressed me. It is very intelligently designed with thoughtfully purposeful goals of creating a design that is comfortable, supportive, and easy to control. It executes all of these so cohesively, it's incredible. But with a shape like this, just be aware that it may feel clunky. So try to define what you personally look for in a mouse before purchasing, and if a good range of motion and overall effortless feel on large angle movements is something that is important to you, then you should probably stay away. But if that checklist of comfort, support, and control is what you want, then this is going to be one of the best options out there easily. Then, of course, in typical Vaxee fashion, everything else about the mouse is flawless. The clicks and build quality are best in class. The scroll wheel is preferential, but I personally really like it. The feet are great as far as stock options go, and even the cable is perfectly fine. There's really nothing bad I can say about this mouse. It is so good. It has easily become one of my personal favorite mice overall, and is really a slept-on design from my favorite company. So please really take the time to consider the NP-01 and to make sure that it does not completely slip under the radar for your next mouse. It deserves all the attention it can get. Alright, thank you for watching. See you all in the next one.